we can post it to our website and YouTube for future viewing and your reference after the series is done. We will have a facilitated question and answer session after Kyle's presentation. I'll be moderating that, and we'll walk through how to do that when we get to that point. In the meantime, I will be monitoring the chat in the waiting room, so feel free to pop stuff in there as you want, and we'll try to address it along the way or get to it at the tail end. I believe that is it. With that, I'd like to toss over to today's presenter, one of our fire risk reduction specialists, Kyle Reed. Kyle, take it away.
Well, hi, everyone. Again, my name is Kyle Reed, and I am the fire risk reduction specialist for the Oregon State Fire Marshal that covers Coos, Curry, Douglas, and Lane. We're housed in the Community Risk Reduction Unit, and there's 7 of us spread across the state, working with homeowners, community members, fire departments, and other local, state, and federal agencies, trying to tackle the wildfire issue that we're seeing year after year, threatening homes and communities across the state. The presentation today, before I get into it, I just wanted to cover a couple things. Is going to be focused today on the vegetation side of things. When we're talking defensible space, typically when I do this presentation, we incorporate the home hardening aspect of that as well. And I'm not going to be covering that today because tomorrow we have a full webinar that's focused on home hardening. So today's presentation is going to focus more on the vegetative fuels and other fuels that we see around our homes. All right, so before we get all the way into this, I wanted to talk about what ignites structures. So many of us have this preconceived notion. We've seen the pictures and the video clips on social media and on the news of these large flame fronts that are coming down towards homes and communities. And it's very a shock and awe images a lot of times. But what they found over the years is more often than not, those large flame fronts will move by the structures without igniting them. But we've continued to see structures burn during wildfire events. So they've done some more research and more studies, and what they found, more often than not, it's not the large flame front, but it's the embers that get cast off into the smoke column and picked up by the wind and blown on or around structures. And really up to about 85% of the structures that are lost in wildfires can be attributed to something as simple as embers. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to mitigate not only the direct flame contact from the structure, but we also need to look and mitigate where those embers are going to land and what they could potentially ignite. The other thing I want to throw out here before we get too far into this is a lot of times when I talk defensible space with people, they have this idea that they have to cut everything. They've got to clear cut everything. They got to create a moonscape around their home to protect it. And that's far from what we have to do as well. We do need to mitigate the amount of vegetation around our homes. We don't want that continuous fuels bed from the back 40 all the way to the back porch. And we're going to talk about all that more in the coming slides. But we can incorporate vegetation into our landscape. We want to incorporate fire-resistant vegetation. All trees are not bad around homes. Trees will provide some shade, which will keep the temperature down, the humidity up, and actually some of them will act as a shield and prevent some of those embers from hitting your home. So we'll get into all that in more detail as well, but I wanted to throw that out there too. All right, the other thing to throw out there real quick is we've all heard about the fire triangle, the 3 things needed for a fire to occur. You need a fuel source, you need oxygen, and you need the heat or the spark. And once that happens, the fire starts burning, will continue to burn until that fire triangle is broken. We have a similar fire triangle once the fire occurs. It's called the fire behavior triangle. And this is the 3 things that influence a wildfire once it starts burning. And that's the fuels, the weather, and the topography. So going through these real quick, starting off with the weather, we have no control over the weather. It is what it is. But when we're talking weather for a wildfire, we're not only looking at the weather the day the fire happens, but we're looking at the fire over the previous week, the previous month, 6 months, back to a year. Have the conditions leading up to that fire been warmer than normal? Have we seen drought conditions or more precipitation than what's normal over that time period? The day of, we're looking at winds and relative humidity readings. Winds are a huge factor in wildfires. So we have our local winds that we're used to, but a couple of the big watch out situations for wildfires are cold fronts and east wind events. So when a cold front comes through the area, we'll see some very strong winds that change directions on us as that as that cold front passes over us. The east wind events are what we saw during the 2020 fires, up and down the Cascades with the strong warm winds as those winds come down off the Cascades. They compress as they come down through the river valleys, and they warm up and they get stronger. So again, we have no control over any of those weather factors. The next one is topography. So we're looking at the slope and the aspect of where our homes are located at. So we're looking at, is the home located in the valley bottom, on top of the ridge? Is it mid slope, somewhere in between? Is it in a box canyon or a chute? All those factors play into what we need to do for defensible space. The other one is the aspect. So when we're talking aspect, we're talking what side of the hill is your home located on a north slope, on a south slope, or somewhere else in between. So the north slopes are generally a little more shaded, a little cooler, and will retain a little bit more moisture than the south slopes, because the south slopes will receive more surface heating during the course of the day. Generally, we see a lot more lighter, flashier fuels in these areas. So those are things to watch out for as well. Again, if you're looking to rent or purchase a home, you have a little bit of control over picking a home with different characteristics that may be favorable for you. But once you've picked where you're going to buy or rent, you don't have much control over the topography in the area. And that brings us to the last one, and that's the fuel. And that's where we really have control over our situation when it comes to defensible space. And when we're talking fuel, we're talking the kinds of fuel, we're talking the amount of fuel, the arrangement, both horizontally and vertically, and also the fuel moisture contents of that material. And again, we're not only talking vegetation. Vegetation is what we focused on for many years, but a wildfire doesn't know the difference between a plant or anything else that can burn. And honestly, our homes are giant boxes of fuel for a fire. So we have to, take that approach to mitigate everything around our home and our property. So the next thing here, where do we start and how much do we need to do? There's again, a lot of research that has been done over the years by a lot of very smart scientists, much smarter than I am. And what they found is about 100 feet of defensible space is adequate for most homes. Depending on slope or topography, or fuel loading, you may need to increase that in certain circumstances to 150 or 200 feet. But for the majority of homes, 100 foot of defensible space is adequate. And then I get asked, where do we start? If we've got, 100 feet we need to worry about or more, it can be overwhelming, especially if you have a lot of vegetation to clean up on the site. Where do we start? We want to start at the structure and work our way out. The biggest bang for our buck when we're doing work ourselves or hiring somebody to do work for us is at or immediately around the structure, and then start working your way out from there. The first 5 feet around the home is going to be the most important. And then, work your way out to about 30 feet and focus around that first 30 feet out around the home. And then take it out to 50 or 60 feet and focus on that area, and just break it up into chunks that are manageable so you don't get overwhelmed and walk away from the situation right from the get-go. Because we do want to encourage everybody to do what they can to mitigate this risk around their home. All right, so getting into some of the things we can actually do. So our biggest risk from wildfire is our roof. And again, we talked about those embers. Those embers can get up into in the air with a smoke column, get caught by the winds, and those embers, can easily blow a mile. There's been reports of embers landing 5, 6, 7, 8 miles away from the main fire before. And again, this is our biggest surface area on our home. So a simple solution here is, just getting on the roof, blowing that material off, getting up on the ladder, and cleaning out the gutters. Now, typically we think about the fall being the time of year to do this as the rains start coming back, the leaves have fallen. But depending on the kind of trees you have around your home, this may be a multi-summer project for you. Fir trees, pine trees, stuff like that will continuously drop needles over the course of the summer. And typically it's during the peak parts of fire season, the hottest, driest parts of the year. My grandmother, for example, has several pine trees in her backyard, and on a daily basis, we'll rake up, 1 to 2 wheelbarrow loads a day just out of the yard. And that doesn't count what's in the gutters or on top of the roof. So if you have those kinds of trees nearby, that's something to keep an eye on so we don't have that dry tinder directly on top of our homes. All right, so now looking in the area immediately around our homes. So the first 5 feet around our home, what's recommended is to have a 5-foot non-flammable barrier. So this could be rock, it could be a concrete walkway, it could be pavers, it could be bare dirt. What we don't want to see in this area is bark mulch or the rubber mulches or other dry vegetation. And again, we're trying to create a barrier there. If a surface fire does come up towards your home, we now have a 5-foot barrier all the way around your structure. So that way those flames can't come into direct contact with the home. Bark mulch and rubber mulch and stuff like that, we don't want to have those in this area because, those are ignition sources. So those embers can blow in there, land on that mulch and, directly underneath your siding and potentially ignite your home that way. So this completely eliminates that opportunity for fire to get to your home. We also want to minimize the vegetation in this area. And I'm not saying we can't have anything at all. I'm not saying you can't have, a potted plant or a hanging basket on the porch or even a rose bush on the side of the house, but we don't want to have a lot of vegetation here. And again, the reason for that is to minimize the opportunity or the chance for fire to come into direct contact with the side of your home. If there is anything that we're going to have relatively close, we want to make sure it is a fire resistant plant. And we'll cover that here in a couple more slides on what that means. The one thing I will point out here, we see a lot of people that'll plant stuff in front of windows for kind of a privacy barrier. And the problem with that is when you get vegetation that ignites right up against a window, especially with older windows, single pane windows, stuff like that, they have a tendency of fracturing and breaking out due to that heat right up against the window. So I really encourage people not to plant stuff directly in front of windows. A couple other things here to mention is we want to move all of our other flammable materials away from the side of the house or underneath porches. So, this is a great example of what we don't want to see. Totally understand why they're trying to store the firewood there to keep it dry, make it convenient to get in the winter months. But this is a huge fire hazard. When you start thinking again about those embers blowing into the area, they can get in the nooks and the crannies of that firewood, ignite the firewood, and now we've got all this fuel directly underneath the porch here and underneath the house. So this is exactly what we don't want to see. Firewood piles, lumber piles, gas cans, propane tanks, all these kinds of things need to be stored properly. Firewood and lumber piles, at least 30 feet away from the home is what's recommended. Propane tanks, we see a lot of those for like barbecues, small propane tanks like that on porches, back porches, things like that, decks. If they're not in use, just store them away so they're not an issue. We don't have to worry about them at that point. So some of these simple tasks can go a long way in mitigating the risk of wildfire to your home. All right, moving on to the grass. So, that the grass within the first 100 feet we want to maintain. And if we can keep that green, that is awesome because that grass is not going to burn if it's green, if it's irrigated and green. I totally understand many people in town don't have the means of doing that. And once you get outside of town and off of municipal water systems, it gets even more challenging. People that are on springs and wells or maybe have to truck water in probably don't have the means to irrigate all summer long. And that's okay. What we want to do in that instance is we want to make sure that once that grass dies out, we want to keep it mowed down. With that being said, that is a potential ignition source. So make sure that you check ahead of time in the summer months if you're mowing dead or dry grass, that you're following the rules, restrictions within the allowed hours, and all those things. And once you get that dead grass knocked down, it's not going to be an issue for the bulk of the summer. You may have a weed or two that pops up here or there throughout the area, but it's not something that we have to be that concerned about at that point. What we don't want to see again in this area is that 4 or 5 foot tall dead dry grass, because what happens is typically if that burns, we're going to see flame lengths twice the height of that. So our flames are going to be 8 to 10 feet tall, compared to if we have very short grass, our flames are going to be 6 inches or less typically, and that's going to be a lot more manageable in terms of fire. If it does burn all the way up to our 5 foot barrier around our home, it's not going to come into contact with our home, and we're good to go there. Some other things, we touched on a couple of these already, but removing the other flammable materials from around our home. So that's the leaves and the conifer needles, that's the dead wood, the bark mulch, and debris within the 100 feet of our home or to the property line. Again, we can only focus on, or we only have control over what we have control over, and that's where we really want to focus our energy to get up and going. The one thing I'll throw out here, a lot of people want to put some mulch out and around plants. Again, we don't want that directly around the home. If we do have it, 30 feet or farther away from the home, be mindful of where you're putting it. We don't want to have just a huge bed of mulch everywhere. Again, that's a great receptive fuel for embers when they blow in there. There's some other great options out there that we could use. But again, the big focus for the mulch is right around the home. The leaves, the needles, all that other stuff, we really need to get that stuff picked up, before we get into the heart of fire season, because again, that's all going to be great receptive fuels for a fire. All right, so the next thing we need to talk about here is ladder fuels. So when we're talking ladder fuels, this is going to be the vegetation that ranges in size from the grass to the small brush, to the bushes, to the small trees, and all the way up to the branches on the large trees. And what happens here is if a fire is coming through, it ignites the grass, which ignites the brush and the smaller trees, and all the way to the large canopies of the large trees. And that's what we're trying to eliminate, is that ladder for the fire to climb up. So we're trying to eliminate the viney materials, the blackberries. We've maintained the grass already. Start working on getting rid of some of the lower growing shrubs and bushes and the younger trees. Now, there may be some species there that you want to keep, and that's okay. But we need to space that stuff out. Make sure that stuff's not growing right underneath one of the trees that we want to keep. One of the larger trees or a smaller tree we want to keep on the property. So there's some give and take here. We don't have to remove all the smaller stuff out, but we do want to be mindful that we don't have that continuous fuels bed for the fire to climb from the surface all the way to those canopies. Because again, a fire in the canopy is much harder to suppress than a fire on the ground, and we don't want to have that situation directly around a home or another structure. Talking specifically about the trees themselves. So before we start cutting trees, I always encourage people to do a walk around and look up and down and around before you start cutting stuff. So especially with conifers typically die from the top down. And the last thing we want to do is cut out a couple healthy trees to leave a tree we at the end find out is dead at the top and dying. It's not a healthy tree. We also want to make sure that we're not leaving trees that have multiple tops, because the top has been broken out previously. Those trees aren't as strong as other trees that have a single top. So making sure that we leave both healthy and strong trees are important. So again, make sure you look up and down and around. But once we start getting to spacing, kind of the rule of thumb for your baseline spacing is 10 foot between crowns. So that's not trunk to trunk. That's from the outside branch, the farthest outside branch to the farthest outside branch of the next tree. And again, that's rule of thumb. Depending on your tree species, you may need to have more space in between that. because they're more fire prone trees. Deciduous trees, on the other hand, most of those are much more fire resistant, and some of those are very fire resistant. In those instances, maybe you can take your spacing down a little bit, between those kinds of trees. So I really encourage people to talk to a local forester, whether it's somebody through ODF or an arborist. Talk to your local fire department, somebody that knows the fuels in your area, and get some pointers of specifically the vegetation you have growing on your property, or what you're interested in planting around your home or on your property. But again, the general rule of thumb is 10 feet between crowns. We also want to make sure that we have 10-foot spacing between the crown of a tree and our home. And again, that's breaking up that separation there and keeping the fire from having direct contact. We don't want to see the branches growing over the roof or over the deck or things like that. Same with power lines. We want to make sure that our branches aren't growing up into power lines, because that is also a potential ignition source. So with that, I do caution people, don't just go out willy-nilly and start cutting things down. Get a hold of your power company. If there truly is an issue, most of them have fuels mitigation crews that focus on the vegetation and the right of way growing up into power lines, and they can probably send somebody out to take care of that. If they're not able to, your next best bet is to hire a contractor that has expertise in working in this situation, because again, all it takes is a miscalculation on cutting the tree or a shift in the wind, and you've got a really bad day if that tree goes through the power lines. The other thing to talk about real quick here is we also want to prune the trees up that we leave. So we want to make sure that we prune those trees up at least 6 feet from the ground. And again, that's removing some of that ladder fuel component, and hopefully trying to do everything we can to keep the fire on the ground rather than climbing up into the crowns of the trees. With that being said, younger trees, we don't want to remove more than 1/3 of the height of the branches. So for the example they have here in this graphic, we have a 12-foot tall tree. We don't want to remove more than 4 foot of branches at this time. As that tree continues to grow, we can continue pruning those branches up, and once it gets past 18 feet, we can get that full 6 foot of separation there. And again, this is the minimum standards. Some people want to take that up higher, maybe up to 10 feet, and that's okay too. As long as we're not taking too much off at one time, so we're not compromising the health of the tree. All right, so we mentioned earlier fire resistant plants, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about those. So first of all, nothing is fireproof. Everything will burn at some point, but fire resistant plants will have characteristics which allow them not to burn as readily as other vegetation. On the flip side of that, there's fire prone vegetation that is basically made to burn. It's designed to burn for a number of different reasons. But right now, talking about the fire resistant plants, there's a number of characteristics there to kind of help identify those. So the leaves are moist and supple. The plants will have little dead wood material that builds up inside of it or on it. They don't accumulate dry dead materials within the plant. The water is sap-like, or is water-like, and not have strong odors. And then the sap and the resin materials are low compared to other plants. So those are all some great characteristics if you're trying to figure out if something you have is fire resistant or not. Another great resource is this brochure here from OSU Extension. So this is a fire resistant plants brochure. The QR code and the link down here will take you to their website where you can download a free copy of that. And again, this is a great brochure. It has a number of different plants, from annuals and perennials to shrubs to trees, which have the characteristics of being fire resistant. With that being said, we do need to make sure that we're maintaining these plants. One of them that I like to point out in here is it has ponderosa pine listed as a fire resistant plant, which it truly is, especially when it's a large mature tree. It's got thick bark, the branches, the way that they grow with separation between them, it truly is a fire resistant plant. But the byproduct of that is all the needles that get cast off during the summer months. And so some of these fire resistant plants, there's a give and take on the plant itself is resistant, but the byproduct we do need to maintain. So then again, going back to those slides at the beginning of this presentation with the roofs and the gutters or the needles within the first 100 feet, again, when those start dropping in the middle of the summer, we need to get that stuff raked up and taken care of. So again, great resource. Do some research and really think about what you're planting and where you're planting it in your yard and landscaping. On the flip side of that, we have some highly flammable plants. So these are some of the ornamental type plants that we'll see that people will plant in their yard or their landscaping that are an issue. So ornamental juniper is very common, both the shrub and the tree, because it's one of those you kind of plant it and forget about it. You don't have to do much. That's what is burning in this video here is a juniper bush. This was a fire during the 2020 fires here in Douglas County. So we've got a little bit of wind on that, but the bulk of that flame is coming off due to the oils and the resins in that material. Some of the other ones we have, the Leland and Italian cypress, eucalyptus, rosemary, arborvitaes are very common. People plant them to try and make a barrier, whether it's so they don't see their neighbor or keep the noise down or keep the dust away. Those burn very hot and very fast. Another one is pampas grass, and you don't really think about that, but pampas grass burns, again, very hot, very intensely. Some of the other highly flammable plants we see that are either native or invasive throughout the state, and by no means are either of these lists comprehensive. This is just some of the common ones that we deal with on a frequent basis. But Scotch brooms and other kinds of brooms, gorse, manzanita, ceanothus, blackberries, juniper, sagebrush, cheatgrass are all big watch out things that we don't want to see around our home. You know, here in Western Oregon, I've dealt with blackberries for a number of years, and blackberries will go from they won't burn very well to all of a sudden they're exploding. You know, and it seems like from one day to the next it can change. And when you hit that point of summer, and when you hit that point in summer, you don't want these close to your home. Not a good situation there. All right, so the next thing here, I often get asked, what do we do with outbuildings, barns, and those kinds of things for defensible space? And ultimately, if you want to create or if you want to protect your homes and outbuildings and structures, you need to have defensible space around all those buildings. And the tactics are no different than we've talked about already. We want to utilize fire-resistant building materials when we can. We want to mitigate the amount of vegetation. We want to keep the grass maintained around it. We want to have our 5-foot barrier around those. Outbuildings and barns pose some additional challenges. As you can see here with all the extra hay on the ground, that's a great ignition source for those embers blowing in. So maybe that's something you go out on a periodic basis and clean up. Or if there is a fire nearby, you can go out and clean that stuff up relatively quickly, get it scraped away from the building so we don't have that potential problem there. The other challenge with outbuildings, barns, things like that is we tend to store a lot of treasures in these areas that we don't always keep around our home. So this could be gas or diesel or other flammable liquids. It could be paints or paint thinners or solvents or firewood piles or lumber piles. It could be piles of cardboard. It could be the broken down car that the window's broken out on. You name it. We need to be mindful of what we have around these structures and make sure that we're storing these materials properly. Otherwise, they are going to be prone to ember ignition or ignition from direct flame contact. But again, if we do a lot of those things we've talked about, mitigate the fuels around it, create a non-flammable barrier around it, keep the roofs cleaned off, it's going to increase the chances that these homes can survive or these buildings can survive a wildfire. All right, the next topic here, what do we do when our defensible space overlaps with a neighboring defensible space area? So again, as I've mentioned a couple times in here, first of all, we only have control over what we have control over, and that's what we're owning or renting. So that's, again, where we want to start and focus our efforts on. Ultimately, though, what we do or don't do is going to affect the neighbor and vice versa. So we want to have that conversation with the neighbor and encourage them to do everything they can on their side of the line, especially in these more urban type settings where we have homes built very close to each other. Again, some of those studies that have come out show that if you have a building that ignites within about 60 feet of your home or other building, the chances of it igniting increases dramatically. So again, we want to do what we can to mitigate all those fire risks. I totally understand, there's the situation out there. I've got phone calls for years about it where one neighbor has done everything on their property, the other neighbor has done nothing, and they don't want to do anything. And unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do in that situation right now. So in those situations, we really have to focus on what you can do on your home and your property to make the difference. There are some programs out there that can help though. So the Firewise USA program is a great example of a community-based program that's designed to help homeowners and community members address risks in their home or around their home and in their communities. It brings the community together to come up with local solutions. So there's not a one size fits all in terms of the size or scope of communities or the tactics used to mitigate those issues that are identified as wildfire issues. So this is a great program. There's others out there like it across the state and across the country. Find what works for you and your community and run with it. And there's also, other civic groups locally that you could tap into potentially, whether it's a Boy Scout group or, other nonprofits who are out there looking for projects to help in their community. So there's a lot of opportunities out there to find help and assistance, not only for your home, but around your community as well. The next piece here is we've done a lot of the mitigation work, but what do we do with that vegetation that we've removed? So there's different options here. They all have pluses and minuses, but we need to do something with that vegetation. We don't want it just piling up and being a ignition source down the road. So starting off here with taking the material to a landfill or a recycling center. This is a great option because it completely removes the fuel and the vegetation from around your home and your landscape. The downside to this is it can be expensive and it can be labor intensive as well. So you've got to cut the fuel, you have to drag the fuel, you have to haul the fuel or load the fuel onto the trailer, drive it to the recycling center, unload it. But again, the nice thing is once that's done, you don't have to deal with it anymore. Composting is another option, but again, depending on how much you have or what kind of materials you have, it may not be feasible to compost that material. Shipping is another great opportunity directly around homes because it helps mitigate that fuel, and we're not having the risk of burning it right up against the home in a debris pile or something like that. But if we're able to haul those chips off, that's even better to completely remove that fuel. But a lot of times when you're chipping, you don't have a truck to blow that in or a trailer to blow that in. That's okay too. If we can chip that material, blow it away from the structure, spread it out. A lot of people like to put it in, mix it in with their garden to give some nutrients back in the soil, or spread it out to let it decompose. Again, we don't want those heavy concentrations right up against the home, but the farther off we can get it, the better we are there. Another downside to chipping is if you don't have a chipper, you're going to have to rent one or hire a contractor who has that. So there may be some potential costs associated with chipping that material to factor as well. Piling and burning is another option. Again, this isn't something that I recommend right up against the house, but if you're getting back towards that 70, 100 foot mark away, this is something to consider. Before you go out and light the pile though, because Kyle said it's a good idea, please remember that escape debris burning is one of the leading causes of fires throughout the state year in and year out. Check with your local fire department or ODF district to find out if permits are required or if burning is actually required at the time when you're trying to do that. Some cities, some areas have certain months where due to air quality factors or fire danger, all debris burning is shut down. So again, check ahead of time, but if you are allowed to burn, make sure that you stay on site while that burn's taking place. You have a small pile. If you have extra material, you can feed to it as you go. We don't want to have those large, super large bonfires because they're hard to manage. Again, make sure we have fire tools on site, we have water on site, and we're staying with that pile until it's completely out, because we don't want to be another stat at the end of the year for letting our burn get away. But again, that is another option out there on the table. And then the last one is lop and scatter, and this is something I would not recommend within that first 100 feet. But if you are doing work beyond that 100-foot mark, this is another opportunity. And what lop and scatter is, it's getting the material cut down and then getting it to lay flat on the ground, spreading it out and letting it naturally decompose back into the ground. I've been on projects in the past where we've done all or most of these tactics, depending on where we're at. So when we're working directly around the home, we would chip the material. And then as we got farther away, we would pile the heavy concentrations of material that could be burned later on. And then what was in the areas that were sparse, it was all lop and scattered. So sometimes it's not a one size fits all, but there may be other things that, you prefer one over the other, or, it doesn't make sense to drag everything, all the way to the chipper, the trailer, whatever. So again, if you need some ideas, some pointers, there's lots of resources out there for you to reach out to get some ideas on what may work best for your situation. Most important thing is to understand that you have to maintain the defensible space once it's done. It's all going to grow back over time. You can either do this annually, where you maintain everything all at once, or you can break it up into 2 or 3 blocks and do this over several years. What we don't want to see, though, is you go through and invest the time, energy, effort, money, create the defensible space, and then not maintain it, because this is all going to grow back over time. There's multiple projects I've worked on in the past that have not been maintained, and it's hard going back and seeing those areas. The other thing to keep in mind is, if you do open up the canopy too much, you may see a lot of undergrowth start growing in there that you didn't have in the past. And that's because now you've let more sunlight in there. So that's something to keep in mind too, is if you open up the canopies too much, you may get a lot more growth than you were expecting. And then the last thing to touch on here is those urban fuels. And we've talked about this a little bit, but this is all the non-vegetation materials that are flammable that are out there that we need to think about. A lot of focus is always on the vegetation. But again, if we're talking about those embers blowing in, we've got to think about where we're storing all this stuff. Gas cans, propane tanks, firewood piles, lumber piles, lawn furniture, vehicles, outbuildings, hay. It could be the chicken coop, the play structure. It could be the welcome mat on the back porch. It could be the broom. It could be the pile of cardboard that we've neglected taking back to the recycling center. All these different things and many other, again, are potential ignition sources and potential fuel for fire. I've been on fires in California several times, and what we were assigned to do was to be working in front of that fire about a day or 2 days, and we were pulling all these different things away from the home, throwing the lawn furniture off of the deck, or at least the cushions off of the deck. Eliminating these issues ahead of time will go a long way during the event of a fire. And I'm not saying we can't park the vehicle next to the home, but something as simple as rolling up the windows, making sure the windows are rolled up when we're not using it, so the embers can't blow into the cab and ignite the material in the cab, can go a long way. And it's a simple solution to the problem. Making sure that the outbuildings are properly taken care of, that we've created defensible space around those, is a fairly simple thing that we can do to help mitigate the ignition of that structure, which could potentially ignite our home or other outbuildings around the property. So again, some pretty simple things, making sure stuff's stored, or some other simple mitigation tasks can go a long way. A couple other things to point out here before we finish up. So these are always things that I like to point out to homeowners when I'm visiting with them. Is your address sign visible from the roadway? It seems silly to talk about, in a fire response because there's a smoke column, but if you have 2 or 3 or 4 driveways heading in the same area, if we take the wrong one, we're either having to cut through fences, go through gates, or backtrack and try and get in the right way. So if we can have a visible address sign from the get-go, it can speed up not only fire response, but law response calls and medical response and those kinds of things. With that, though, I encourage people to go down, take a walk to the end of the driveway and make sure that the sign's visible, that it's still there, that the grass hasn't grown up in front of it, a branch hasn't grown in front of it, somebody hasn't ran it over, somebody hasn't stolen it. Make sure it's there. Reflective is always better, but make sure it's visible. Another one is, do you have two ways in and out? And this is both in and out of your home and in and out of your community. So it may be, roads, or it may be having access through a field, through a neighbor's field, or through, another logging road or something like that to get out of the area if you have to, if your primary egress route gets cut off. Another one is, do you have a bridge? We see a lot of bridges in the rural areas, but a lot of these bridges aren't rated to allow fire access or fire truck access across them, or large heavy equipment across them. So there's going to be times, depending on the capabilities of the bridge, we may not be able to get fire apparatus to your home. And in those instances, it's important that you've gone above and beyond creating the defensible space around your home, including the home hardening, to mitigate that risk, because we may not be able to get apparatus through the home at the time the fire is taking place. Another one is, do you have adequate clearance for the driveway and then a good turnaround spot? So again, driving in and out with small vehicles, small cars, it's something we don't think about a lot, but now we have a large fire apparatus or heavy equipment trying to get in and out of a driveway. They're banging the branches that are overhead with the cab of their truck. And now you throw smoke on top of that and you can't see 10 or 15 feet in front of you. If you have a long driveway, it's very hard to get that equipment in and out of there safely. The same with the turnaround spot. If they don't have a safe spot to turn a large fire truck around, they may not be able to send that truck in there. They may have to find a smaller truck to head in there, or they may not be able to get in there at all. So if you have questions, a good resource is the fire department themselves. Give them a call, set up an appointment, have them come out and, do that drive with them and find out which branches need to come out for that driveway clearance and, the turnaround spot at the home for the apparatus as well. The last one on here is looking at those other fuel breaks on your property. And this is one that, I really encourage people to think about and looking for those opportunities to create or maintain. So, it could be the driveway, it could be other roads, it could be walk paths or trails. I don't know how many fires over the years I've seen stopped on nothing more than a deer trail. So if you have a prominent trail already going through your property, maybe that's something that you mow several feet back on both sides, prune the branches up, and now we have another line of defense from surface fires that could be potentially approaching your home during a fire event. So all these things are just another thing to keep in mind as you're working around to create your defensible space. With that, that kind of wraps up my presentation. I'll turn this back over to Chris here in just a second. I do want to highlight the upcoming webinars that we have. So tomorrow, again, we have a Home Hardening 101. So we focused on the vegetation, other fuels today. Tomorrow, the focus is on the home hardening. So what you can do to the home itself with fire-resistant building materials, or other modifications to decrease the chance of your home igniting. Looking into May, we have some information on FireWise, the 5 E's of community risk reduction. We have CWPP's, community wildfire protection plans, and what those are, how they work. We have an emergency preparedness webinar, fire resistant plants and flammable plants. So that's going to be one I'm really looking forward to at the end of May, talking about both plants that are fire resistant and those, again, going into more detail on those that are not. And then when we roll into June, we're looking at some webinars for public safety power shutdowns and kind of a fire season outlook before we get into the peak of fire season. So the QR code here will take you to our OSFM website where you can actually register for any and all of these webinars if you're interested. And with that, We're going to open it up to questions. If you don't want to ask the question here, feel free to give us an email, and we'll address those questions as they come in.
Thanks, Kyle. Great presentation as usual. I appreciate that. So yeah, we'll do facilitated question answer now. I see we have one great question in the chat, which we'll get to, but just to cover some housekeeping here. Two ways you could ask a question. If you pop it in the chat, we will address it, hopefully before the hour is up. Also, if you want to raise your hand, you can do that at the taskbar at the bottom of the Zoom window, and then we'll call on you if you just want to unmute, ask your question, and Kyle will be happy to address it. With that, Kyle, I want to start with this one, the chat, and it is, what is the mulch recommendations for around buildings?
Can you say that again, Chris?
It's, what are the mulch recommendations for around buildings?
So mulch around buildings. So we don't want to see flammable mulches around buildings. We want to have that 5-foot buffer of some kind of non-flammable material, whether that's rock, whether that's pavers, concrete, bare dirt. I understand that's not, traditional mulch, but the problem with mulch, whether it's a organic material or the rubber mulches, is that's great places for those embers to land, ignite that mulch material, and then we have direct flame contact right up against the side of our home, which we're trying to mitigate. So we don't want to see mulches within the first 5 feet of a building or a structure that we're trying to protect. Other places on the property, when you get beyond, that 5 foot, especially, that 50, 70, 100 foot, if there's plants out there, we want to throw a little bit of mulch on. Again, that's not the end of the world, but we do want to be, conscious about how much mulch we're using, because again, that's great receptive fuels in the summer months for those embers to land in and ignite something either on our home or around our home.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Question from, let me get back up here. Corey Jones, is there a process to request someone from OSFM to come to your house and invite wildfire risk? And I will pop the link for our Defensible Space program in the chat. That is probably the best way to do it. An alternative is to contact your local fire risk reduction specialist, and I can go ahead and pop that link in as well.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, there's a lot of resources out there for people to tap into in addition to OSFM staff. There's a lot of fire departments at the local level who are getting into, whether it's assessments or evaluations, being that resource for the local community to help them out, answer some of those questions. Our partners at ODF have resources. They have grants availabilities where they have partners that can come out and assist with that. And I've really been seeing a lot of nonprofits over the last 10 years, but really the last 2 to 5 years really pick up in a lot of these areas as well and fill in some of the gaps where there may not be other options. So there's a lot of opportunities out there for a number of different agencies or organizations to help out.
Perfect. Thanks for that. I'll pop the links for our D-Space program and our program, Fired Up Oregon, the Community Risk Reduction Unit in the chat. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anybody online would like to raise their hand, we'd be happy to call on you for Kyle to answer questions.
There is a question here in the chat about propane tanks. So they've got a large propane tank 50 feet away from the home. Sounds like they took out a tree already that was near it. And they asked, what else should they be looking at doing? So propane tanks really aren't a big factor for us. When we see them levy during large fire events, it's typically because the structure is ignited and that it takes that much heat and energy to get them to that point. Typically, if you've installed or had a propane tank installed to code, it's going to be relatively safe. We don't want to have a lot of vegetation around it. We want to minimize that too, but we don't, again, have to clear cut everything. So hopefully that answers that question. If not, feel free to shoot us an email and we can address that further.
Thanks, Kyle. And also from the chat, Catch Probably, thank you. Question about Oregon grape, out of whack on the property. Is that something they should remove from their home?
So I do believe Oregon grape is one of the more fire prone plants. When you look at the scheme of things, we can, if you email that crr@osp.oregon.gov, I can do a little bit more research and get back to you. And then we can give you those links for some fire resistant alternatives in those areas as well.
Thanks for your question, Pam. It looks like going through the chat, we're caught up. Again, if anybody on line here would like to raise your hand, we'll be willing to call on you and have Kyle answer your questions. Okay. Seeing none, Kyle, any closing thoughts?
I guess over the years, I've been in the fire service for about 20 years now. And, we've seen large fires increase and large fires get a lot of attention. I always stress, it doesn't have to be the large fire that takes out your home or outbuilding or whatever else. It could be that 5-acre fire or that 1/4-acre fire in the wrong place. So again, there's always a lot of focus on the large fires. But once we get into the peak of fire season throughout Oregon, it really doesn't matter where you're at. Fire is a threat. So, just keep that in mind. It's not, again, just the big fires to be concerned about. It's the small day-to-day fires, many of which we don't hear about because they don't make the news because the fire departments catch them at a very small size. But again, the wrong fire at the wrong place can be very devastating. But there's a lot of things that we covered today and will be covered tomorrow with home hardening that can help you mitigate that risk. And a lot of those can be done fairly inexpensively and with, some elbow grease, but a lot of these activities are doable. So again, there's a lot of resources out there for people, whether it's local fire agencies, OSFM, ODF, other partner agencies, nonprofits. Tap into the local agencies in your area. A lot of them are willing to help. They have a load of knowledge, and at the end of the day, everything we can do to mitigate a home is going to help out.
Excellent. Thanks for that. We appreciate the thank yous and the comments. I did see a couple questions regarding the recording, and our PAOs did join us here. It will be available on our YouTube channel this afternoon. And we appreciate the thank yous. Well, with that, we'll stay here. If anybody has any questions, I'll stay on until everyone drops, but feel free, enjoy your day. Again, Kyle did post a link in the schedule for the rest of webinars. We hope to see you there. And feel free to reach out to us if we could be a resource. Thank you and have a good afternoon.